You are listening to the Primitive Intelligence Podcast, episode 616, Thinking Outside the Box. I'm going to do my best with this one. I got completely derailed this week with an interview I listened to yesterday, and I want to touch on it a little bit without trying to recap it. It's the Terrence Howard interview with Joe Rogan. Crazy amount of information in this podcast. I want to talk about that. I'm going to touch a little bit on what I was going to do this week, which is UFO stories from a book I just started reading, but I got completely mesmerized by this other thing. So I'm going to try to put the two together. So bear with me for this week. This might be a disaster, but I'll do the best I can. So without any further ado, this week's episode of the Primitive Intelligence Podcast starts now. So like I said, the book I started reading for this episode was a book called Not From Here, Selected UFO Articles, Volume 4 by Preston Dennett. And I started reading that, and there's so many cool stories in there that I want to go through more of it before I do a full episode on it. But I do want to touch on a couple of the first stories I looked at, and they are pretty cool. But I'm going to do that at the end. First of all, though, I want to talk about this interview I listened to yesterday on the Joe Rogan Experience with Terrence Howard. Now, if you haven't heard about this interview, there's gonna be a lot of articles that you see that come up about this, and I'm gonna pull up my browser real quick, and I'm gonna just search it. All right, the Terrence Howard, and you're going to see headlines that are gonna make you think this guy's nuts. Terrence Howard claims he can kill gravity in off the charts Joe Rogan chat. Some people really remember their own birth. Experts give their verdict after Terrence Howard made astonishing claims. What else we got here? So when I initially did when I first looked this up, initially yesterday I was seeing a lot more negative headlines on this. People calling it the craziest interview he's ever had, and just making it out as a joke. And I think it's easy to do when you think, okay, Terrence Howard is an actor. Terrence Howard's the actor from Empire, and he was the original roadie in the Iron Man movie, among many, many, many other things. He doesn't necessarily mean he can't know something else, right? So, yeah, when you first start listening to this podcast, and I think if you just listen to the very beginning of it, you would think this guy's nuts, he's off his rocker, and you can't take anything he says seriously. He does mention that he has memories from birth, actually from before birth, in the womb, and that he had some very interesting experiences as a young child. And for a lot of people, that would immediately make them think, oh, he's crazy. Researching what I research, listening to the podcasts I listen to, especially things like Mysterious Universe, where they've been covering this stuff for 17 years in 2 different versions of their podcast. They've covered stuff like this a lot. These stories aren't as crazy as you think, and it's not as rare as you think. What he's saying, although it sounds extraordinary, is more common than you might believe. And a lot of times, people who have these insane experiences when they're children wind up doing some pretty incredible things when they're older. They seem more motivated, and they seem more open to science, right? Not the narrative that is laid out before everybody. And I want to talk about that a little bit as well, because there is a certain group of people, and it's not like they intentionally do it, I don't think. But when you get to a certain level of education, you suddenly feel, or they suddenly feel, that they can't be wrong. Now, I've had this happen myself. I've talked to people. I did an interview last year. I mean, the guy's way smarter than me. Way, way smarter. And we got to a point where we were talking about alternate realities or simulation theory. And he made a comment about what the numbers say, what the math says, what the science says. And I said, yeah, as far as we know. And he's like, no, we know. We know how it all works. And as soon as someone says that to me, I don't discount them, but I start to question, because I don't care how smart you are on this planet, how smart you are as a human, if you believe that you understand how the universe and reality works based off of math that we have created, and sure, we can make things fit explanations, but is it right? We don't really know. So I don't like absolutes like that. I never have. I don't like to claim something absolutely until after it's happened and I can verify it. And even then I'm, ooh, was that right? So yeah, this kind of window that closes for some people when they reach a certain level, I think it closes you off to more possibilities. I just had a thought and it just escaped from me as I was saying that. Let me see if I can get it back real quick. So we've observed ourselves as humans, how reality we've observed ourselves as humans, how reality can adjust to our perception of it. We've seen electrons and photons and atoms change their behavior based on what we expect that behavior to be, and based on whether we are actually observing it or not. And I talked about this last season, and I think, Is Reality Really Real? I think that's the episode I talked about it, where it's very possible that everything we see is catered to us because of our perception. And that may be what dimensions are. That may be what alternate realities are. There could be other things living right next to us, right alongside us, or in the same space we're in, who have a slightly different understanding of how things work and see a completely different reality, and are living a completely different reality, even though we're in the same space, because quantum dimensions are crazy like that. To sit there and say we absolutely understand how the universe works because we've invented a math, and we've invented that math based off of our own observations of how the universe works, is crazy, because we could be completely wrong, and our math is only a side effect of our observations. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm saying it's a possibility. So with that being said, and listening to this 3-hour interview that Joe Rogan had with Terrence Howard, I'll be honest, my initial impression, my initial thought was, this guy's nuts. Just listening to some things he was saying, he's nuts. The part of what Rocco was telling me about the interview that got me to listen to it was his thoughts on gravity. Now, I think I've mentioned this before in a podcast, and it wouldn't have been a whole episode, so I'm not going to dig through them all to go find out where I said it, but I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before, where it hasn't happened recently, as far as I know. But when I was, a few years ago, it was when I was writing more music, and I think it's that creative process that kind of spurs this kind of stuff on. But I would wake up in the middle of the night, go to the computer, type out a few paragraphs of something, and go back to sleep and forget about it. And then a few weeks later, I'd find it, and I'd be like, well, who wrote this thing about how to find all the points needed to calculate time travel? Who wrote this? And it's probably all nonsense. I'm not saying I'm getting some divine information, but these things happen. Like, your mind sometimes is thinking about something, and when it's ready to get that information out, it just does it however it can. So one of these instances was this thought that occurred to me that gravity, and I think I was researching a lot of the super force, right? Is that the grand unified force, where they're trying to get all the forces. They're like, all the forces must fit together somehow, and we can't figure out how to get them all to fit together. And the sticking point was always gravity. Like, we can get weak and strong force and electromagnetic and electricity. We can get all that stuff to fit, but gravity doesn't want to fit. And the simplest answer to that is that it's because gravity isn't a force. In the way I think, the way I see it, the way I think about it, and it's got a little bit of quantum mechanics in it, and a little bit of probably sci-fi. I'm not saying, don't take what I'm saying as this is, like, I don't base everything I do off this. It's just an idea that space-time is like a fluid. A universe is like a giant cell, and it contains the fluid of space-time. Mass and matter inside that inside of space-time is solid to a point. And this we already know. This is proven that even if you're sitting at a desk right now or a table or wherever you are, even you feel solid, right? These things feel solid. But if you were to be able to zoom in close enough, you'd see that there's space in between the atoms. And space-time is infinitely small. So space-time can flow through, but the mass acts like a sieve. And the more the mass, the less it goes through and the more things stick to it. Now again, probably crazy, but the idea that gravity is not an actual force caught my attention when this is one of the things that Terrence Howard was talking about. Now he has a different idea of how it comes about, and I don't necessarily disagree or agree with anything that he says, but it's just a different way of looking at it, and I'm all for looking at things a different way. And his idea is that in the 1800s and earlier, there was the belief in the ether. And in the 1800s and late 1800s, they did an experiment to try to prove that the ether was or was not there. And their baselines showed that there was no ether around us. And we went with it. We were like, okay, it doesn't exist. And everything's been based off of that idea since. Now, Terrence Howard says it's a flawed experiment because you can't test for something that you are in, because all of your experience will be skewed to that natural bias of being within the ether. Not his words. I'm just trying to explain it the best I can. And it makes sense. Like how, if you're a fish in water, how do you prove that what's outside the tank isn't water if you can't get there? So he's saying if you factor the ether back into it, and it wouldn't be detectable because they were looking for movement in the ether. But if everything is in motion, then we would never see the motion of the thing that's moving us because it would be relative. And that's not a crazy thought. So he bases everything, he just took that as the diverging point where things started to go wrong. And with that thought of there being ether, his concept is that the mass and matter are concentrated. I don't know if they're concentrated energy, but they have an electrical capacity, and electromagnetic capacity because of their contents and the fact that they exist. And then they create a drag, so to speak, of force, of electrical and electromagnetic force as they move through the ether, and the ether moves around it. That difference in the charge is what causes gravity. And in his mind, gravity is, I believe, opposites attract, and magnetism is the opposite of likes attract. And I don't think he's talking about magnets, but like magnetism, the force, I think, because he's saying that it expands. But I guess, no, I don't know. Magnetism does repel its own, does expand. I guess if you really think about it, if you try to put two like-sided magnets towards each other, they push each other apart to expand. Okay, there's a little bit to that if you twist your thinking a little bit. But that's his basic idea, and I don't want to try to absolutely explain his theory because I don't really understand everything about it, because this interview was 3 hours long, and the very probably first hour of it was all over the place. Now, he does talk, and I think this is where people immediately lose interest in what he's saying, is in the beginning of this interview, he talks about how he has memories from the womb. And when he was younger, he had some very unusual experiences that started as dreams. And maybe in his pre-birth memories, it was more of a real thing. Like he said, he remembered being in the womb and looking at his hand, but he had a different name for it. Like he knew it was a thing and he knew it was part of him, but he had a different name for it. And I can relate to that. I don't have memories that far back. I do. My initial memories, my earliest memory is, and I've mentioned this before, is I could have only been weeks old, maybe, and being in a very soft blanket, being held by, I believe, my grandmother in her living room, because we had this living room that was blue. It had blue paneling, blue painted, this half paneled wall. It was blue and blue Everything was blue. They had a blue carpet. It was like, this is just blue room. And I remember that. I remember being young enough that I was in a crib and young enough that I didn't have language and wanting a donut, I think. It was a donut or a cookie. And I didn't have the word, but I just saw it. I pictured it in my mind. I want a donut. So in my crib, I stacked up all my animals that I needed to get over the top and threw the rest of them, like my stuffed animals and anything I had in there that was soft, I threw over the end where there was a big pile of toys and stuffed animals and stuff sitting there. So it was soft, like I knew. And I climbed up and over and then out the door, down the stairs in the kitchen. My mom was on the phone. I like tugged on her leg and she just looked down at me like, how did you get out? Like, what are you doing down here? I wanted something. I wanted a snack. So when he's saying these things, yeah, I don't dismiss that. And there are plenty of stories. I've mentioned before, I listened to a podcast called Mysterious Universe. They've been doing 2 concurrent seasons of a free show and a paid show for 17 years. They've got so much content and they talk about stuff like this. So none of this is a surprise. So if you're not familiar with these kinds of things, this might throw you off. This might just make you think this guy's nuts. That's not what threw me off. I heard that and I was like, okay, all right, maybe it's possible. People remember past lives. People remember the time between incarnations. People remember all kinds of things. And I apologize if you can hear the train whistle in the background. They remember these things. Why is it so crazy to think that someone could possibly have memories of being in the womb? A lot of times people who remember things, and I'm not saying this is me, but remember things early or have experiences early, continue to have experiences or go on to lead some kind of exceptional life. Now that's clearly not me, but it's not unheard of. So to believe that because he's an actor, he can't have other ideas is insane. I am a little guilty of that because in the beginning, I thought this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's heard a bunch of stuff. He's putting it together and he's just throwing it out. It was maybe an hour into the interview where Rogan interjects and they start talking about something. He stops him for a minute. And I think it was a good thing to do. It gave him a break and then it refocused him. And I'm going to touch on a couple points of things that I really think if any of this kind of stuff interests you, you should listen to this. But because I want to go through and listen to it again because, man, some of it is nuts. So one of the things he talked about was in his dreams, he was shown how he was shown this pattern. And I think it wound up being the flower of life, because I do know he talks about that. But this pattern allowed him to realize that the periodic table is wrong. And if you look at elements as frequencies, then if you think of, I'm going to get this wrong. If you think of the periodic table and you think of elements as frequencies, the way they double, the way that it's like octaves. It's like sound. And he shows these charts of the periodic table and how it would work. And it's like this serpentine. It could be spherical if you look at it one way, but if you lay it out, it's like the serpentine that looks like a wave, looks like an audible wave or a light wave. And it's basically what he's saying is that on this wavelength, we can perceive light in certain wavelengths, and we can perceive reality in certain wavelengths. And when we get those wavelengths, we start to see solids, we start to see elements. Again, that's my interpretation of it. I could be completely wrong about what he's saying, but that's how it seems. And with this thought, he starts to ties us into, so basically what he's saying is like this grid of the periodic table is the wrong way to look at it. It should be laid out. It should be shown as a wave, and it makes things easier to understand. And you can see that at some point we won't be able to see those elements anymore because they're going to be too expanded. They'll be too outside of our perception. So then this brings him to the tree of life, or I'm sorry, this brings him to the flower of life. And he starts to talk about this as now the flower of life it's basically a bunch of circles that overlap in the Venn diagrams, if you can picture this, and then it creates like a 6-petaled flower in the middle. But it's all based off of circles. And he believes that the initial interpretation of this was that what they did was they connected the points where these, if you overlap them and you create the shape, you start to see straight lines within these circles where they connect. And straight lines don't exist in nature, because even if you draw a straight line and you magnify it out to it, you don't see a straight line. You see all the bumps and ridges and wiggles in it. And it's interesting because straight lines do occur in nature, but they're not common, and they're probably not completely straight either. Like he's saying there, if you look at them close enough, they're not completely straight. So this brings him into looking at the negative space between where these circles meet. He looks at the tree of the flower of life in the 3-dimensional aspect instead of just as a 2-dimensional plane. He goes, what if we're looking at this and they're not circles, but they're spheres? And what happens as they meet, and where do they connect? And it matches, like he creates these shapes, and I guess the easiest way to describe it is geometric shapes out of the negative space between these spheres. And he starts to realize that if you take these shapes, if you get to a certain point, you can take these shapes and create structures out of them that are infinitely expandable. So you can connect these shapes together and create anything. And again, I'm really skimming over what he's saying because there's a lot of information. This building of these shapes, you can make models of molecules, you can make models of planets, you can do anything with these. And then he gets to this point, and so up to now, there's some things that I go, okay, I can agree with this, or I can agree and disagree with a lot of what he's saying. I could go either way on it. But he then starts to talk about gravity, and this is where he really gets into his thoughts on gravity and how it's not a force. And so Rogan's doing his best, and Rogan's, listen, so how do you explain, like if you've ever been in a plane, how do you explain this? And he's like, you're feeling the drag of this. And he's got answers for these questions. Again, I'm not going to try to, he's got answers for these questions. I'm not going to try to answer for him because you really have to hear his answer out to understand what he's saying. But he's thought about these things. And then he gets into the age of the universe and how planets are created. And this is the one thing where I don't know. He's done some work to show that this is right, but this is probably one of the crazier things he says in his interview. So basically, we're going to take just our solar system into account here. And he says that the idea that stars are born, there's material left over, they create rings, they coalesce into planets, they coalesce, a star is born, there's debris left over, that creates like a flat disk, which then coalesces into rings, which then starts to coalesce into small rocks, which then coalesce into planets and then create the planets. He's like, it doesn't make sense. It was, and if you don't have gravity, that can't happen. So, real quick aside, there are people with some theories, like flat Earth, who say gravity doesn't exist, but they don't have a mechanism to replace it. And you need to have, because we know that there is something that keeps us planted to the Earth. We know, we can predict how gravity should work. We can predict what it will do. So there's something going on. Now, we'll call it gravity for the sake of ease. But like I said, flat Earth, they don't have an explanation for it other than the fact that the plane of the Earth is constantly moving upward, and that's what causes things to be pulled down. But in order for that to be the case, there would have to be gravity in existence for that to work, because you can't move through a vacuum without feeling the force, and we don't feel the force. So whatever, but he does have a mechanism for this, and it's this electrical drag. So his idea on how planets are formed is unique. So basically, the sun is a star. We start with a star, and it starts to eject matter through its breakdown in the way that the star actually operates. And at a certain point, all this starts to, because of the electric drag, because of the gravity, the non-force gravity, the electric drag gravity, what he's talking about, it then creates a sphere because that's a natural shape. And then it ejects it. Because, and this is a proven fact, that the planets are slowly moving away from the sun. I don't remember the math. It's not far. It's like 0.06 inches per year. They're constantly moving away from the sun. So his theory says that at a certain point, Neptune popped out and it started moving away, and it moves away and it moves away and it moves away. And at some point, it was where we are in the Goldilocks zone. And maybe it had life on it. And then over millions and millions of years, it drifted out. And then Saturn was created. And then Jupiter was created. And then Mars was created. And then Earth was created. And Venus was created. And we're all slowly, these planets are all moving through the habitable zone with life existing. Civilization creating itself. Civilization rising, falling. Planet moves out of the habitable zone. The planet dies. It goes into another phase. And at some point, Earth will not be the third planet from the sun anymore. It will be the fourth planet from the sun. But because of our lifespan, we never see that. It's moving, it's happening so slowly on such a grand scale that we don't see it. And then his idea is that possibly the asteroid belt was a planet that had civilization on it. And now his idea is that they had something like the CERN super collider, and they created they did something, and they basically broke the bonds of their planet and popped their planet. Now, I don't know if he's saying he absolutely believes that, but it may just be, this is something that could have happened, because there is a lot of debris in the asteroid belt. And how did that get there? And why hasn't that coalesced? Why hasn't that turned into a planet? Because maybe it was. Then he starts talking about Jupiter. And this is amazing. So he starts talking about Jupiter, and he's got a partner who does a lot of the computer models and things like that. And he says, look, what I'm going to show you, it's not an animation. This isn't something that we created and we're just playing back. He goes, this is a simulation that we're going to put all the components into, and we're going to run it. We're going to let it do what it's going to do. And using these ideas and having zero gravity in the simulation, zero gravity in no gravity as a force, but gravity as the effect of electric drag, like he's saying. They run it, and it creates Saturn, right down to the hexagonal pattern at the top, at the North Pole, complete with the rings. And it does it without gravity. And I cannot explain how that could happen unless, now I'll play devil's advocate here, unless that's just what, it's easy to make a simulation do what you want it to do. Now, I'm going to take him at his word that they're doing this correctly, and they're doing this because he says, look, he says he's ready for people he's gotten his paperwork in order. He feels he's in a position now where he can they've tested this enough. He wants people to look at this and take it seriously. And I think people should. You don't have to agree with him. But if you are, he's talked to Neil deGrasse Tyson and someone else he said he talked to, and I don't remember who he said. He talked to a couple people, and they basically were like, no, everything you said is wrong. You're looking at information that's wrong. Everything you said is wrong. And if you want someone else to help you with this, go talk to someone else. And I think that's a really shitty way to handle that. If you are, and Rogan says the same thing, if you're an educator, if you're someone who is telling people to go look for answers, learn, and push the boundaries, and someone comes to you pushing the boundaries, and they push your boundaries, and you're like, no, I think that's the wrong way to handle it. So I would like to see people take this more seriously. The Saturn thing was mind-boggling. Now, And here's the thing, and I think this throws people off, because when you hear this much information from one person, so he had these memories before the womb, he had these crazy dreams when he was a child that showed him how the universe works. He's got a different model of the periodic table. He's got a different way that gravity works. He can build planets, and he got a different idea of how planets are made. He can build a planet in simulation with his own theories, and it works. And people are like, this is too much. It's too much for one person to be thinking about. But once you get down one of these paths, do they all lead to each other? He then starts to talk about this new form of propulsion that he's generated. And you're like, come on, really? Because if you're just thinking about patents, you're like, anybody can make a patent. If you got the money to have a patent, anybody can make a patent. And the crazy thing is, these aren't just patents. He's got a team of people that work on this. They have made working prototypes of this, and it uses these shapes that he's derived from the flower of life, using the negative space that basically filling in the negative space between the flower of life, if you're looking at in a 3D pattern, and where the spheres would touch. By using those, he's figured out a way to make a propulsion system that is super efficient. And not only that, but you can connect multiples of these together to increase its workload. Like, I'm not entirely sure how it works, but he shows video of it actually working and picking things up and flying around like little drones. He also says he has a way to create energy out of water, to get more power out of it than you put into it, energy. And I'm not sure. Again, when you start throwing this much information around people, it's easy to say, oh, this guy's nuts. But everything he's talking about, he either has clearly done a lot of work in looking into it, and maybe his calculations are wrong, who knows? But he's looking, and he can't be that wrong if he's got working prototypes of this, unless the videos are faked, but they don't seem to be. I don't know. I don't know what to make of this. As he's talking about this, and he's talking about how he very easily he gets dismissed by people who should be more open to learning. This is when I start to put a little more credence into what he's saying. Maybe he's not 100% right, but I do believe, and this is where, like I said, my opinion completely changed throughout this interview. I went from thinking he's out of his mind to maybe he's on something. Maybe not completely right, but maybe he's on to something. Because I have also noticed that when you question someone who is, quote, highly educated, who should be more interested in finding the truth, who claim to be interested in finding the truth, and you push their boundaries, you immediately become wrong. No, you don't. We know. I did the interview last year with a gentleman way smarter than me. Very clear, way smarter than I am. We start talking about the possibility of living in a simulation, because he deals with a lot of maths and things like that. The possibility of living in a simulation. And he goes on to, he's talking about quantum probability and all this stuff, and and this is how it would work. And I just basically said, as far as we know. And he's like, no, we know the math, we know. And it's a really small-minded way to look at it, to think that we, as moderately advanced apes, have created a math that may only be an effect of the reality that we perceive, using that to say that we understand how everything works when we haven't left this planet. We've gone to the moon, but that's about it. How can we say we know how things work way out, or outside of our universe? We don't know. And we're talking about physics and laws of things that we have no idea how they work. So I definitely suggest, and like I said, I'll put a link in the show notes, check out this interview with Terrence Howard and give it time. Don't just start to listen to it and think, oh, he's nuts, and walk away from it. Listen to it. Really listen to it. Listen to what he says and listen to how he says things. because that's where it changed my mind. I don't, like I said, I don't fully agree with everything he says. I don't know if anything he says is right. I don't know that anything he says is wrong. What I'm saying is it is a completely different way of looking at reality in the universe, in life, that if you really are interested in truth and knowledge, you can't dismiss it. You really can't. You don't have to accept it, but you really can't dismiss when someone's apparently done the work. So that was this interview with Joe Rogan. Incredibly crazy. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm probably going to listen to it again because there's so much to unpack in that interview. So definitely check it out. I did not do it justice. I really didn't. So go listen to it and let me know what you think about it. Now, like I said, that was not originally what I was going to talk about this week. I've been having fun doing these episodes, looking at stories from different genres of the paranormal, different aspects of it. And I found this book, They're Not From Here. Not From Here. So, yeah, from the book, Not From Here, Selected UFO Articles, Volume 4 by Preston Dennett. I believe this was released in 2022. And it looks at various styles of UFO cases. And I'm gonna read some of the chapters in here because I'll read these off because this is what really got my attention. Chapter 1, UFO car lift cases. Chapter 2, Independence Day encounters. Chapter 3, I crashed into a UFO. 4, UFOs over airports. 5, ETs in fertilizer. Chapter 6, when abductees levitate. Chapter 7, probably my favorite title in here. I'm going to really want to dive in this. I punched a gray in the face. 8 is extraterrestrial hitchhikers. Chapter 9, those damn UFOs. Chapter 10, take me to your leader. So I really just started this, and I want to touch on a couple of the car lift cases because they are crazy. And if this is an indication of what the rest of this book is going to be, and this is only, let's say I got 1, 2, 3, I got 4 of the many reports out of car lift cases. I'm going to touch on those, and then I'm really looking forward to the rest of this because these are crazy. So the first one was basically extraterrestrial AAA. 1959, 3 teenagers from Hollywood, including a 14-year-old Bradley X, that's his pseudonym, traveled to Goldfield, south of Tonopah. I don't know if I pronounced that right, where their pickup truck got stuck in the sand. Despite efforts to free it, the truck became deeply embedded, forcing them to spend the night in the desert. While stargazing and discussing UFOs, ironically, Bradley's girlfriend suggested they try to telepathically contact a flying saucer for help. That's probably not a good idea. Surprisingly, they soon noticed a bright moving light resembling a star. As it approached and hovered above them, the truck was inexplicably lifted a foot or 2 off the ground, moved back to the road, and gently set down. The light then disappeared. Initially, the teenagers reacted with fear, not surprisingly, quickly leaving the scene. Decades later, Bradley reconnected with his girlfriend, and they both recalled the event, albeit with slightly different emotional reactions. He remembered screaming. She remembered laughing. The witnesses chose to remain anonymous and did not seek publicity, reporting the incident only many years later. The case is notable for its unusual details, but it's not unique in UFO literature. So that was, I think that was the first one I read. It was like the first or second one I read. I thought imagine you're just stuck. What if you got a flat tire? Can you contact UFO? Like, hey, can you fix that? The next story, just have a title here, Yellow Tube Light. 1965, September. Mrs. A.V. of Brussels, Belgium, experienced a bizarre incident while driving home. She was traveling on a familiar route at nearly 60 miles per hour when her steering wheel inexplicably malfunctioned, causing her car to swerve. Assuming she had a flat tire, she attempted to slow down. Instead, her car inexplicably lifted several inches off the ground. A small, glowing, yellow, tube-shaped light, about 27 inches long and 1 or 2 inches in diameter, appeared beside her windshield. and moved to the center. During this time, Mrs. AV lost control of the car, which seemed to float on air for about 150 feet. When the light disappeared, the car was set back on the road, and she regained control. Shaken, she drove home, but did not discuss the incident with her husband until 3 days later. Sometime later, Mrs. AV noticed peculiar marks on her wrists where she had been exposed to the light. These marks, resembling tiny pinpricks in red, blue, and black, itched like first-degree burn and disappeared within a week. 2 years later, one mark spontaneously reappeared and then vanished again within a week. Years later, Mrs. AV had another unusual experience when she saw a similar yellow light at the foot of her bed with her daughter standing next to it. However, her daughter was not at home at the time. This even triggered memories of the initial incident, and then following these occurrences, Mrs. AV experienced more paranormal events and contacted investigators. Emily Teacher and Jean-Luc Vernigan. Despite their research, the reason behind her car being lifted off the road remained unexplained. Now that's, again, another car lift, but another thing that is common in instances like this is there's not just one. There's not just one event. This one I've titled U-Haul Destruction. And this is a little scary. On February 14th, 1974, two brothers were driving a rented U-Haul truck to move their parents' furniture from Idaho to California. At around 4:15 a.m., they were traveling on Highway 93, about 55 miles north of Ely, Nevada. Chuck, a pseudonym, who was driving, noticed four luminous bluish-green objects flying in a row. One object flickered on and off. He woke his brother Dave, another pseudonym, who was asleep in the passenger seat, telling him they were being followed by a UFO. Dave dismissed it and went back to sleep. Chuck continued driving while the objects paced their truck. One object moved ahead, crossed the road, and hovered 10 feet above it, waiting for the truck. Chuck woke Dave again, who finally saw the lights. As they approached the hovering light, it transformed into a bright, orange, luminous ball. They felt a blast of wind or force, making the truck feel like it was floating. And Chuck lost control of the vehicle. The truck swayed like on ice. The lights flickered, the engine lost power, and despite Chuck pressing the gas pedal, the truck seemed to float slightly off the highway, not responding to the gas. Okay. The truck swayed as if on ice, the lights flickered, and the engine lost power despite Chuck pressing the gas pedal. The truck seemed to float slightly off the highway. Dave confirmed Chuck's account, noting the flickering lights and engine trouble. The transmission jumped into neutral, and they coasted to a stop. The orange ball disappeared, and Dave found the drive shaft still spinning despite the truck being in neutral. So he got out, and the drive shaft is still spinning. The brothers then saw a large silver-shaped object with a dome and wings, kind of like very short, stubby wings, floating over a hill. And ahead of them, a brilliantly lit object blocked the road. Chuck had a strong impression that they were, quote, coming to get us, unquote. Frightened, the brothers focused on the giant UFO blocking their path. Dave blinked a flashlight at the object, which caused it to move towards the truck. Chuck urged Dave to get back in the truck. They felt isolated and trapped in a vacuum. Strange spears of light came off the object, which had a reddish outline on top. And suddenly, the object disappeared swiftly, and the brothers were relieved. The encounter lasted about 20 minutes. The truck was disabled, so they flagged down a driver who took them into town. The local U-Haul station replaced their truck and found severe damage to the stranded vehicle. The back axle was twisted off, and the drive shaft was welded into the rear end. When the truck was towed, the rear wheels fell off. The truck needed extensive repairs, verified by UFO investigators. Both brothers were traumatized by the incident. Dave said, quote, "It took about 30 days for it to sink in my mind that I really saw it," unquote. That would be, imagine a 20-minute UFO encounter where you're floating off the road and you basically are surrounded by UFOs. And then your truck won't start. They didn't mention how long it took for them to flag down another car, but that had to be terrifying, waiting for somebody else to come by. And then this is the last story I want to touch on for this episode. because there's hundreds of reports in this book, but these are just from the car lift chapter. So this one is interesting because of the multiple reports, which is what I have it titled as. But again, a very similar description. Early in the evening of July 26, 1978, several unusual sightings of a fiery UFO were reported in Union, Missouri. Around 8 p.m., Jeannie Carter and two friends saw a large, bright orange ball, like in the last report, with flames coming off of it while driving along Highway 50. They chased it for about 10 minutes before it disappeared, and then they called the police. Later, between 9:30 and 10, Ruth Steiferman and her children observed a bright white object moving silently at treetop level outside their home. They also reported this to the police. An hour afterward, two anonymous witnesses saw a brightly lit object resembling a sideways Ferris wheel with colored lights hovering over Highway 50 and contacted the authorities. Shortly after midnight, Velma Kleins saw an orange-red ball moving at treetop level towards her house and then towards Highway 50. Another similar object followed. Both were silent and glittered with orange light. What's with the orange light on these things? At around the same time, Clara Winsher was driving on Highway 50 when a giant object with a brilliant light appeared ahead. She thought it was a tractor trailer. She was bracing for impact. When it shined a bright light on her car, it lifted the back of her car off the road, causing the entire car to heat up and shake violently. The object eventually set the car down and disappeared. She got out of her car, found that her wedding ring was off of her hand and laying on the driver's seat, which she couldn't explain. And there was two minor dents in the trunk of her car. Afterwards, Winsher experienced various health issues, including body aches, headaches, loose dental fillings, and fingernail problems. A week later, she woke up with blood coming from her nose and ear, and her symptoms persisted, leading to hair loss on the right side of her head, suggesting a more severe incident than initially thought. They're interesting. These were all from, I think, 1970s, 1980s, from between 1960s and 1970s, it looks like. An orange glow, orange or yellow glow, and picking up cars. Through the history of UFO sightings, they've evolved, and sometimes in step with popular culture, or maybe the opposite way. Maybe popular culture evolves in step with UFO sightings. But in some of these, with the multiple people seeing these multiple reports, in this last one, of people seeing this orange light and all around this highway, and then this woman claiming that her car was picked up and her having all these health issues, is what's going on? You don't hear about this anymore. I don't think I've heard about a levitating car UFO encounter in a very long time. And I could be wrong, but you don't hear about it much anymore. It's like none of these say that the car was completely picked up off the road and taken away, or they were found on a spaceship or anything like that. It just slightly picked them up. It was a new technology and they were testing it out. And they want to see, can we do that? Can we pick that thing up? Like, why else would you do that? It's really bizarre. It's really bizarre. And I'm looking forward to going into the rest of this book. And I will have more of these stories in a future episode. But that's just a little taste. And I'm hooked. And this is volume 4. I gotta see if I can find the other volumes. I don't know how many there are. But really well done, the way the stories are put together. So very much looking forward to finishing this one up. But that's going to do it for this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts on the Terrence Howard interview. If you have a chance to listen to the whole thing, let me know. And yeah, I'm curious to see what other people think of this. If your thought process is similar to mine as you listen to it, where the more you listen to it, the more you kind of think, well, maybe he's not as crazy as he initially sounds. Let me know. podcast@primitiveintelligence.com. That's always the best way to reach me. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, you can just leave a comment. Also, let me know if you guys have any UFO car car lift encounters. Have you heard of any recently? I'd love to hear that because I haven't heard of any. But there's going to be more than just car lift encounters. I'm really looking forward to the I punched a gray in the face chapter. I really want to read that. That should be neat. But that's going to do it for me for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Enjoy the rest of your week. See ya.